Good evening. I'm Diane Sare, and this is the New York Symposium with Diane Sare. I'm a LaRouche independent candidate against Chuck Schumer. And as advertised, we're going to be talking tonight about Afghanistan. And one of my guests this evening is on a very short schedule, so I want to get to him right away. Let me first say, as always, participation in the symposium does not necessarily constitute endorsement of my campaign, nor do I necessarily endorse the views of my speakers, although tonight I think that is not going to be an issue at all, but it'll be fun. And just let me say that our conference, this symposium tonight, is on the eve of an extremely important conference being sponsored by the Schiller Institute, which begins tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, which is on the topic of Afghanistan. It's called A Turning Point in History After the Failed Regime Change Era. And there will be speakers from American whistleblowers like Ray McGovern, diplomatic representation from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, American military. It'll be a very, very important dialogue. And I would urge everyone to listen to it. And without saying more, we can perhaps get into this later, but I do want to say that Helga Zepp-LaRouche stressed that the strategic situation right now is extremely dangerous. We did have a very important summit between Presidents Biden and Putin on June 16th, but then immediately as the ambassadors were coming back to represent their governments in the other's nation, the United States slapped a whole new round of sanctions on Russia. We had Wendy Sherman, the Deputy Secretary of State, just visiting her counterpart in China. And it sounded like a very reasonable discussion, but then the next thing you know, President Biden is giving a speech saying that if there's any more cyber warfare, we may well have a shooting war with China and Russia. So this is extremely dangerous. I don't know if we can just chalk it up to his old age, or what I think must be alarming for other nations is the faction fights and warring differences inside the US administration. We saw that earlier with the Trump administration. His efforts to get our troops out of Syria were thwarted. He did some things that were extremely ill-conceived. And it's very hard to judge. And that's why it's so urgent that the American people be informed and involved. So tonight I'm joined by two musicians who are also long-term associates of Lyndon LaRouche. My first speaker, Dave Shaven, is going to be talking about perhaps an idea for the United States in its actual incarnation as a nation dedicated to the good and counter to the policies of imperialism and the British Empire. So Dave, why don't you go ahead?
Well, thank you very much for having me on, Diane. Basically, there was a time where the United States made the best effort ever to break the British Empire's control over Afghanistan. This goes back to the 1830s, 1840s. The British fought several wars to make Afghanistan into their colony. There's a lot of other issues I won't get involved in on that. But after World War II, in 1946, the United States began a Tennessee Valley Authority project in Afghanistan. It was named, the name it came to have is called the Helmand Valley Authority, the HVA. And it was a full-scale project to build hydroelectric dams and to use the irrigation, the possibilities of irrigation to conquer the desert. They actually ended up building 8 dams on this Helmand River. I've always had interest in this because I grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where the TVA system in the 1930s and 40s simply transformed a backward area of the country. They ended up building 32 dams on the Tennessee River. Where I was from, they used to have flooding. 4 or 5 floods in 50 years before the TVA started, major floods. Mosquitoes, malaria in 1/3 of the population. It was a backward area, and it totally got transformed. 1946, Morrison Knudsen, the firm out of Idaho that built the Hoover Dam, was hired to start building a dam on the Helmand River in Afghanistan. They over the next 6 years, it was 1952 and 1953. It took 6 or 7 years to build the first couple of dams. The U.S. Export-Import Bank was very involved in this. They ended up coming up with about $40 million worth of loans. Sounds like pocket change today, but previously the Helmand region ran through an area, very arid area, that got about 2 to 3 inches of rain per year. It's called the Irrigation Desert. And this whole area got totally transformed. After 100 years of the British running that area where you could grow opium, opium got wiped out. They grew grain. They had the desert got conquered. It was turned green. So the Helmand Valley Authority was officially established as the Afghanistan government agency in 1952. But they did exactly what TVA did. It wasn't just getting some energy from some hydroelectric plants. The main plant, the biggest one they did was called the Kajaki Dam. If you have a picture of that, we might want to show that. It's a 52 megawatt capacity dam, where it was the biggest one in Afghanistan until about 10 years later. The Soviets built a 100 megawatt capacity dam. And this is the Russian. It turns out the United States, the Russians, and India are the 3 countries that got excited about pulling Afghanistan out of British hands. And the United States led the way. As with the TVA, the HVA project involved top-down development of the whole region centered upon electricity, irrigation, flood control, but it also included
look at the camera.
But it also included improvements in farm equipment and practices. They built canals that helped to reclaim the desert. Grain and cotton became not only staples of the area, it was really the core of the nation's economy for the next 20, 30 years. Well, I should say, like TVA created a new city called Oak Ridge, which is famous for helping build the atomic bomb, but it was also, you had a place where all the scientists and engineers and construction people, lived. It was built out of nowhere. And they also had Alcoa aluminum. You could actually process aluminum because electricity was cheap enough to do that. You could do a new material chemical process. Was the opportunity for that. One of the side benefits of this, they built a whole new city called Lascarga, where the Helmand River met the Arghandab River. This is where the HVA set up their headquarters. And what they had there was the top quality hospital built. This is only with 8,000 to 9,000 people in the 1950s populating this new city. They had the only co-educational high school in Afghanistan, the first one. They had a mosque that was an alabaster mosque. It wasn't cheap production. Residents had modern housing, indoor plumbing, electricity. One of the punchlines here is that a good old British fellow, head of the British Foreign Office research operation called Chatham House, named Arnold Toynbee, just happened upon the scene in the new city, the Lascarga, in May of 1960. And he commented rather acerbically, the domain of the Helmand Valley Authority has become a piece of America inserted into the Afghan landscape. The new world they are conjuring up out of the desert at the Helmand River's expense is to be an America in Asia. And then he quoted Sophocles to warn the Americans. He used a passage from Sophocles. The craft of his engines surpasseth his dreams, meaning these silly Americans who, they don't have ideas, they just have all this technology. They're going to mess things up. Now, I don't think I have time to go into Toynbee. I'll end with what I want to end with. Maybe we'll comment about Toynbee and his meetings with his role in the negotiations with Adolf Hitler in setting up a British Nazi world view to conquer the colonies for the white men. Otherwise Toynbee is such a nice liberal imperialist. But what happened was, just to jump to modern times, 2 days ago, the Indian Defense Minister, Mohammed Singh, was at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Defense Ministers meeting in Dushanbe, Tajikistan. And what he said, I found very interesting. I didn't know some of this. I was regarding the possible peaceful developments for Afghanistan, how this is going to work out. And what he said was I knew there was something called the Afghan-India Friendship Dam. It was actually part of this TVA project originally way back in 1957. They did the original studies for the feasibility studies for this dam. It wasn't named the Afghan-India Friendship Dam then. They didn't begin until 1976. It was all sorts of delays from the wars and everything else. So in 2013, Indian government, the cabinet voted up a chunk of money to as a development project to build to finish this dam. It's now called the Afghan-India Friendship Dam. Modi and the Afghanistan President Ghani opened this thing up in June of 2016. But what happened 2 days ago is the defense minister mentioned that not just that dam, but 500 development projects costing $3 billion is what India's put into Afghanistan recently. And this totally syncs with what was presented at the SCO meeting by Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, a couple weeks ago, basically saying the key to peace is economic development. You're not going to get Taliban and government people simply to come to the table because they're tired of fighting. You're going to change the realities in Afghanistan by presenting that one group does not have to fight against another group, that the West doesn't have to mean colonial conquering with getting an Islamic reaction against it. The West can actually mean something like these TVA projects. So Singh ended up his speech saying, it was the 20th anniversary of the SCO. He was talking about this is a new type of international institution. This is the type of thing that the SCO is now institutionalized in the world, and that the spirit of what the SCO brings is the same spirit that India has brought to these 500 development projects in Afghanistan. And he ended up with a shocking statement that in the next 5 months, August to December, India is cranking up 2.5 billion doses of COVID vaccine, 2.5 billion. Now, my calculations say they're going to need about 1.3 billion to finish off their job. They're vaccinating all Indian adults, 900 million of them. So they're going to have another, at least 1.2 billion extra doses over the next 5 months, which they've already committed is going to go to their neighbors. Afghanistan only needs about 7% of that to vaccinate every person in the country, man, woman, and child. They've got right now 0.6% vaccination in Afghanistan, and they've had a lot of deaths. It's not the worst thing going on in Afghanistan, but the possibilities, China has already exported 600 million doses to other countries. The United States in the last 2 months has finally got from 4 million up to 60 million, 1/10 of what China's got. So we have a little ways to go. But the point is that there's vast possibilities now opened up. China, India, and the United States can get into a good contest on these things, not limited to vaccines. But that just seems like the most immediate thing that can address people's fears about whether or not they're going to negotiate properly. You can get a lot of people on the Taliban side and a lot of people on the government side who are going to be happy to, get stuck in their arm. Last thing is that desert that was the Registan Desert, which is getting 2 to 3 inches a year, that started to change over the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The United States pulled out of their projects in the 1970s. I won't go into all that story. But let's just, what happened, the famous drought of 1998 in the Registan Desert, up to 100 villages were submerged by windblown dust and sand. The sand dunes are spreading into former farmlands and roads. 100,000 nomads got moved into temporary settlements, which have been temporary for, I think, 20, 25 years. You can get the idea why people get angry and their rage can be manipulated by geopolitical forces. That's what happens when the United States gave up on being the United States. We'll have to do Toynbee some other time.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I know you have to go. So if people have questions for you, I'll convey them, and perhaps you can answer them later.
I think you should answer them tonight's show.
We'll do our best.
I deputize you on that. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thanks. So just let me stress before I introduce our next guest that the point about Afghanistan is it creates an opportunity, a window of opportunity, which will not be open for very long, for the United States to completely change its relationship with the rest of the world. That's the importance of this. And Lyndon LaRouche and Helga Zepp-LaRouche often talked about a dialogue of civilizations in contradistinction from the British policy, which was called bringing out the pig. And what the British meant by that is they would send all these anthropologists and archaeologists to nations and dig up whatever was the worst in their history, whenever they were the most backward and destructive, whether it was cannibalism, witchcraft, warring, invading other countries. And they would put that up on high and say, this is your culture. We have just discovered that your culture is based on fasting for 7 days a week. And that kind of thing is very efficient at wiping out entire populations, as opposed to looking at what other cultures have actually contributed to civilization, how we got to the point that we are at. What were the contributions of China, of Ibn Sina, Al-Farabi, the Islamic Renaissance, the Baghdad Caliphate? What were the contributions of the ancient Greeks, the ancient Egyptians, the Tagore, or ancient civilizations in India? That if you look to the best of each culture, what you find is an area where you're approaching universal principles. And that is where we have to be. And I think there's a great deal of basis for that in this region, which people might not think of. So John Segerson, who people probably know as the director, the co-director and director of the Schiller Institute Chorus, who is guiding many of us through the difficult terrain of Beethoven's Missa Solemnis, is going to be taking us on a tour of this history. And I will say that he is not returning from combat, but just had a small medical procedure. So you'll see the little Band-Aid on his forehead. But John, go ahead.
Thank you, Diane. I first just wanted to say that I am not an expert in this area of what I'm presenting here is things that I found out over the last few weeks, just because I was curious about the situation. It started when I was looking at this book, which a friend of mine, Bill Salisbury, gave to me. And it pointed out that this area of Central Asia, which includes, sorry, hold on, I've got to do a screen share here in order to do this. Let me screen share now. Wait. Okay, here we go. Okay, you can see the book now. So this is the book that I was, it pointed out that this whole area was known as the land of 1,000 golden cities. And that really struck me, because I said, well, gee, I mean, usually you think of Afghanistan as maybe a bunch of nomadic tribes going around and so forth. And that it's, they're all just these tribes warring against each other. But it turns out that that's completely not the case, that it didn't have to be the case, that this area has an incredibly rich potential, as David just mentioned, in terms of the Helmand River, but also just in general. It's the kind of place where these 1,000 cities were oases, because the water is scarce, but there's still a lot of water there. And I just the way I want to start out by this is showing you, I mean, this is without any borders or anything. People always look at the borders And here you have just this whole area, like as if you were traveling in on a orbiting in space and looking down over this area. So you don't see the borders. You just see these areas, and you probably wouldn't see the rivers so clearly as they're delineated here. But I think that's useful just to point out some things in case people are not familiar with this area. This is the Caspian Sea. That's the Mediterranean over there. That's the Black Sea here. Right. And then here you have this body of water that is called the Aral Sea, and I'll mention a few funny things about that. And then the Persian Gulf is here, right? And this is the Red Sea, and then this is the Arabian Gulf here. So we're talking about this area basically right here that I'm going around here, that area. And also you see this river going down here. That's the Helmand River that David was talking about. And then you have the Aral Sea. You have these rivers coming out of it, but actually what's going on is these rivers are going into it. This is what now is known as the Amu Darya River. And this was the Sir Darya River, which, and the Amu Darya used to be known as the Oxus River, O-X-U-S River. And you can see these come through these mountainous areas, all of the sources. These mountains up here that I'm saying, they're called the Pamir Mountains. And then down here, this is generally known as the Hindu Kush, which straddles what is now Afghanistan and northern Pakistan. And then down here, as you get down to this area here, that's the Himalayas. So you're familiar with the Himalayas. And then this is the Indus River. This whole system here going down here, that's the Indus. And as you can see, all of it comes up from these mountainous areas here. There are also some or down here. Let me say something about the water. So water is very, very important with this. And the reason why you had 1,000 cities is because they knew how to manage their water and deal with it very, very efficiently. Just to give you an idea, let me just show you here. Also, some of this is very desert area. This area right here, it's known as the Karakum Desert. It's now is mostly in what's called Turkmenistan. And let me show you another satellite view of that desert, just to give you an idea here. There we go. This is the Karakum Desert here. Again, this was the Pamir Mountains over here. And look at that. That was the so-called Aral Sea, but as you can see, what's going on there? Doesn't look like there's much sea there. It's just a few little black things. And indeed, one of the problems that we have today is that this whole Aral Sea, and then the Amu Darya is this river going right down like this, right along there, right? And then this is Afghanistan down here. And then this is Turkmenistan, and then Uzbekistan here, and then Tajikistan. Those are the three stands. And then Kyrgyzstan is up here. And then, so this whole area has dried out. It used to be a really nice sea, as you can see from that thing. It used to look like that, right? And now it's just barely. Now, what happened? Actually, that's only happened. It's similar to what's happened in Lake Chad in Africa, and of course, the LaRouche movement has been very instrumental in trying to refill the Lake Chad basin in Africa. And here it's a similar situation. What happened is that in the Soviet era, the Soviets got very excited about using this basically as a source of water, and also these rivers as a source of water for a lot of agriculture here. And similar to what David was saying, and what happened is that what they ended up doing is over-farmed this whole area around here, and with a lot of cotton. They're growing a lot of cotton, which really sucks up a lot of water. And so over the years, this thing got smaller and smaller and smaller. And so now this sea is barely a city at all. There's a couple little lakes there, but that's about it. It used to be sort of a little bit salty, but not like the Dead Sea or something. I mean, you had fishing in it and so forth. And of course, as the sea shrank and it got sucked down, you couldn't. It got extremely salty, and it would kill people. Anybody who tried to drink, the animals that tried to drink the water would die, and so forth. So that the place has really suffered, and there have been some very small efforts to try to get it better, but it's still not. There's a lot of work to be done. One of the grand projects that really should be done, it's very similar to Nawapa in the United States. We're bringing the waters down from Canada into the dry western areas of the U.S. Here, the idea is also to take waters from way up north and to canal them down into this area to refill this area, which is a very important project to be done. Okay, so now let's just look at the history of this whole area a little bit. Let's go all the way back to, say, maybe 540 BC. Okay, so this is the period where you had, let's see, you had Cyrus the Great, the Persian, this is the first Persian Empire, the so-called Achaemenid Empire, and it was in 600, around 530 BC, around that time. And then after him, he was followed by Xerxes, who reigned around 486 to 465 BC. That was after they had invaded Babylon. So Babylon was actually part of this also. So we're looking at, though, this area around here called Bactria, which they took over. This area is this area of of these 1,000 cities. Let me just show you a little bit. Well, let me see. Let me just show you a little bit about where Bactria, just to give you an idea here. Let's look at this. There's Bactria, right? So here's the Pamir Mountains. As you can see, here's the Amardaya or the Oxus River coming in here, and then all these cities here. Right now, every one of these cities had this incredible irrigation system. And unlike the Russians, when in the modern day, when they were just sort of farming the area, they were just basically pouring the water in and then getting farming. What these guys did is they knew how to manage the water. They had incredible gardens, but they were all raised above the level of the land in order to prevent salinization. They had incredible water works. Let me show you, and let me show you a friend of mine, Karol Varekin, actually wrote an article, which I will then share with you. Hold on a second. I have to change my share here. Got to share a different screen. Let's see this one. There you go. All right, so this is Karol Varekin, who's an associate of Lyndon LaRouche in Europe, and he wrote this article just recently, as you can see, mostly after I spoke about this. And here's one of they had these incredible irrigation tunnels. This is just one of them, and they were called kanats. Sounds similar to the word canal, and I think that's definitely the case. And I wanted to point out, here's another one. And here's the way it worked. These were gravity-based water systems where you would take the high, you can see, you take it from some place that's a little bit higher and the water table is a little bit higher. And then they would drill down and have these tunnels here. And then that would go down into the area that would be irrigated. But also, this is just very simplified because what they would also have is underground tunnels, many of them underground tunnels. One of the major cities that we're going to be talking about, which is a city called Merv, which is now in Turkmenistan. It was an incredibly complex irrigation system that goes back to probably the second millennia or possibly even the third millennia BC that they had worked. They developed these over thousands of years, even before the Persians came or anything. And they would have, these are populous cities, and they had an entire little army of people who were dealing, maybe 1,000 people whose main purpose was to maintain these irrigation systems. Not only that, but they had divers. They had a corps of divers who could go down and do the work underwater on these various systems. Incredibly developed thing. I also wanted to point out that later on, where is it? Oh, I missed it. Just one second. Thought I had it. Okay, one of the things that Carol points out is that these oases, an oasis is a man-made thing. It's not, these oases are not, they happen because people were there to develop the technology in order to do it. They didn't just naturally occur. Here's another one of these tunnels here. I'm looking for this quote that I've got, which I cannot find. Hold on a second. There it is. Okay. I just wanted to point this one sentence out. In April 7, 1973, Lyndon LaRouche's friend, the French Iranian professor and his historian Ali Mazaheri, who died in 1991, published his translation from Arab into French, The Civilization of Hidden Waters, a treatise on the exploitation of underground waters, composed in the year 1017 by a Persian hydrologist. So, and these are pictures of the plans that he had for these kinds of things. So these were great scientific works, and as things moved along, the sophistication of how they could calculate water flows and things like that were a major factor in them developing the most advanced mathematics of the time, including various trigonometry principles that had to be discovered in order to deal with these things. Okay, let's go back now. Let's go back to Bactria again. Okay, I just want to point out here. No, actually, let's pull back a little bit. Let's pull back to this. Gives you a better sense of it. Here you have something called Transoxania, and that's sort of a generic term for this area around the Oxus River. It's useful, but you can see, and that you have these two areas here: the Fergana Valley, which is also now part of Tajikistan, I think, and then you have this whole area here, which is where the Oxus River comes down, and then there's the Hindu Kush, and there's Kabul. You can see all the way down there. That's the capital of Afghanistan. So you can see that, and then you have these cities like let's see, where's the one that I'm looking at? Yeah, Marv. There's right. And it's MARW, but it's a lot of, and nowadays it's called Mahdi, but back then it was called Merv, MERV. And this was an incredibly developed city. Just to give you one little tiny bit of an idea of that. Hold on a second. And it was a complete crossroads. This is on the Silk Road, of course. People, they had markets and everything, but they also even had air conditioning. And that's what I want to point out here. Here's their air conditioning. this was in the 7th century, but it probably goes back. But what they would do is they would take ice from the mountainous areas that I showed you, bring huge amounts of ice down in here, and so people could go in here to cool off. So it was a really amazing kind of technology that they had in this area. They were you had this area, Khwarazm, up here. Let me show you a little bit of better Khwarazm. Here, let me see. There's the Aral Sea, and this was the area of all the cities around Khwarazm. And Khwarazm was the place where the famous mathematician, which is usually known as an Arab mathematician, but he was really from Central Asia here, Al-Khwarazmi or Al-Khwarizmi came from. And he ended up going to Baghdad, but this is where he came from. And if you're not familiar with him, he was one of the major map makers. He was the first person who created a map which included both the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean as open, as shown them as open seas rather than enclosed lakes. But he was a very pivotal person, and he where was I at? He oh yes, and he's famous, so famous that a crater in the moon has been named after him. It's on the other side of the moon, on the outside of the moon, but there is a Khwarazm crater there to give you an idea of him. Going back to Bactria, just to point out here, you've got Samarkand, you can see there, and let's go to the other one. Here, yeah. All of these places where you had Bukhara, for instance, that's the birthplace of the famous Ibn Sina, who also came from this area. The point that this book makes, and that I was looking at, and that I think it's well established, is that almost all of the people who were the major scientists who ended up during the Arab era, they all came from this area. Most of them did not actually come from the area around Baghdad. So this was sort of the core thought think tank, area for the entire thing. Al-Farabi, for instance, the famous philosopher, he came from even further up north, even above where this map is. So give you an example of the kinds of things with that. So what happened is that Alexander came in, and Alexander came in and this is Alexander the Great. He invaded this whole area and took it away from the Persians in around 329 BC. At that point, he met people in this area who already spoke Greek and were basically Greek. Now, how could that have happened? Well, it turns out that what happened is that even further back, Xerxes, when the head of the Persian Empire there, whenever he found any Greeks on the western end, because they were trying to invade Greece, whenever he found some Greek colonies and so forth that were giving him trouble, he would exile them to this area, right, to this Transoxania area, and say, no, you can't. So he would uproot whole villages and send them out here. So by the time that Alexander got here, there were already whole Greek-speaking communities in this area. So he founded many of these cities. And let me just give one example here. Again, let's go back to Bactria. Okay. Right. And here's this place, Alkhanum. In Alkhanum, which was it was a complete Greek city with a Greek amphitheater which held 7,000 people. During that time, during the Greek period, the plays of Aristophanes and so forth would be performed there. So you had that, and then it was a kingdom which was called the Greco-Roman, Greco-Bactrian kingdom. And let me just see, here is the map. Come on, here. Oh, here we go. Well, Bactrian map. Oh, here it is. Yeah, this is Eucratides the First, who reigned in the first century AD, the second century AD, BC, for many periods in their time. And you can see this is basically Greek art. This was from a coin that was minted there. They were minting very rich gold coins. Just to give you another idea of another place in that area, right there. Right, this was a kind of a medallion in a place called Begram, which was also run by founded by Alexander. You give an idea of the Greek. You see, this is basically Greek art that you can see here from this area. Incredibly rich. So basically what I want to, the point that I want to make in this, and I don't want to go through a long period of maybe we can talk a little bit more about the history of the Arab period, but the Greek, what essentially happened is that this Greek area was overrun at a certain point. Then further on, this area was taken over by in the second century AD. It was taken over by the so-called Sassanid Empire, which was this was before Muhammad, right? So, but it was a Persian type of. It may have called it the Second Persian Empire. And that's when they started translating huge amounts of the Greek writings, and you had entire colonies of Greek writers that occurred during that time. That Sassanid Empire was then taken over by the Arab, the Muslim Empire, starting in around the 7th century. A lot of things were destroyed during the early parts of that invasion. So there are many writings that were actually lost at that point, many libraries that were destroyed. But after a while, the Muslim caliphs sort of changed. And rather than just think they at the first, when they were going to try to convert everybody to do the kind of thing that you think that the Taliban sort of were doing, is that trying to convert anybody and killing everybody who wouldn't convert. But they realized that really wasn't going to work, and instead they actually started bringing in these same kinds of translators and creating an extremely rich culture that occurred, which sort of had the culmination in the era of the so-called Abbasids, which was just around the same time as Charlemagne in Europe. That is around 800. Charlemagne was crowned in 800 AD, and Harun al-Rashid was the caliph at that point, and he was followed by Mamun, who was also very much patron of the arts, and they had entire armies of intellectuals and so forth translating stuff. And all of those people who these caliphs brought in from to Baghdad. Keep in mind that Baghdad was only founded in about 670 or something like that AD. So it was a rather new city, but they brought people in, and but almost all of these intellectuals that they brought in were from this whole area in Central Asia. They were not really Arab in that sense. They wrote in Arabic because that was the lingua franca, but it was not. In many cases, that wasn't their native language. It was these languages of further east. I want to end it there. I'm sorry if I'm a bit scattered about this, but it's a huge amount. The main thing is that there's an incredible amount to discover, richness to discover in this area. And one thing the point that it's very clear is that the only way you have to look at this as a whole area. You can't look at it as just a specific nation. When we're talking about Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan and Afghanistan all pulling together, that is the only way that you're going to develop this area. And if we can develop it with mutual tolerance and mutual respect, which is, I think, what is being discussed now. If we're able to do that, then we do have a really golden chance to once again make this into an area of maybe even many, many thousand golden cities. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much, John. Maybe we can stop the screen share so we can.
Oh, sorry.
Beam.
Okay.
A question has come in, which is something I know I was surprised at. From someone says, build up the economy of Afghanistan. It looks like the Taliban is taking over, then what? And of course, that came up at the conference that Hussein Askari and our guest Shakil Rameh addressed, because there was quite some panic. The Taliban has taken over 85% of the country. But I think so much is determined by the policy, what you just said, respect and development. They said, our guest from Pakistan, and Hussein echoed it, that the Taliban have a somewhat nationalist pride, that they weren't going to be that sympathetic to having ISIS come in or something like that. I think it really depends on the culture. One of the things I've been thinking about is Kagame, the president of Rwanda, who was terrible, probably directly involved in certain ways in the genocide unleashed between Rwanda, Burundi, Hutu, Tutsi in the late 90s. But somehow when he was temporarily the head of the African Union, actually spoke very forcefully in the interest of the continent of Africa in negotiations with China and so on, and rose to the occasion. And I think that's really the difference. If there's an opportunity for life to be better, for people to have a high standard of living, have clean drinking water, the population of Afghanistan is largely under the age of 30. So you realize that means the majority of the people in this country have known nothing but war. Can they imagine a world that is stable, where they can become engineers and builders, and what would that mean? And also, I'll just say, I think Russia's been very firm about what they will tolerate and what they won't tolerate in terms of terrorism or any civil war strife crossing over the border. But John, you may have also thoughts about this.
Yes. Keep in mind that, similar to the situation with Israel, what we're looking at in terms of these countries is the fact that we are, you have to deal with the legacy of this incredible British great game that drew these borders, in many cases for reasons that have nothing to do with the interests of these peoples themselves. I mean, typical is this Afghan border, because the only reason why they drew the border the way they did was in order to create and really the only reason why they had Afghanistan anyway there starting with around the 1820s. The British were absolutely terrified. They whipped up a Russian anti-Russian hysteria, basically, to say the Russians are going to invade. They're going to invade our precious India, and so therefore we have to have a buffer. And so that's why there are no railroads there. It's because the British said, we're darned if we're going to have any railroads going between these things, because then they could come down and invade our great, piggy bank, from of India. So we're dealing with these in a certain sense, arbitrary borders. At the same time, I think so therefore, when you talk about the people of Afghanistan, it's a tricky thing. And I think the only way that you're going to deal with it is that you, again, looking at the whole way that the Arab invasion, the Muslim invasion actually occurred, in the 7th and 8th century, you can see that that it started out extremely brutal. And there was a general, for instance, in the around 700, who came in, and he thought that the way that you were going to, subjugate this area. By the way, it was mostly Zoroastrian. The Sassanid Empire was a Zoroastrian religion, which is a monotheistic religion. But it's different. I mean, it's a fire worshipping religion. But they came in and they said, well, we're just going to kill anybody who's not going to convert. And they tried to force everybody to convert, and it didn't work. And so eventually they sent in a guy there who was named Abu Muslim, who did the opposite. And he went in and he said, okay, well, let's change the Muslim religion a little bit. Let's bring in a little bit of Zoroastrianism and various things, and let's start mixing these things together. Because indeed, there were all sorts of areas there where they were mixing in Muslim and Buddhist. There was Buddhism in this area too. There were all sorts of different kinds of things. He went a little bit too far. And so what happened is that al-Mansur, who then came in, unfortunately, because he was it looked like he was trying to set himself up as a local potentate who was going to be independent. So he got killed, but nonetheless, al-Mansur and then his son Harun al-Rashid and Mamun, who were really the height of things, they realized that's what they actually had to do, is to promote freedom of religion. And they had lots of Jews and all sorts of things. They had Christians. Actually, they brought in a lot of the Christians that the Romans were kicking out. They actually founded some Christian colonies. There's a very famous place called Shapur, which is now in Iran, which was a key place for translating of Christian, Nestorian Christians who were then doing these translations. But there was a lot of religious tolerance, and they matured. And I think that the question of the Taliban is that I think they now are faced with the question of, are we going to become a mature citizen of the world? And the main thing that the reason why we've got this opportunity now is that if we can get the United States to not be insane, I think everybody else is rooting for the Taliban and to actually take up that kind of responsibility. And I think some of the diplomacy that's going on between the Taliban and China is an indication that at least in some parts of the Taliban, they realize that they have to mature, and that there is a question of tolerance, because that is the only way that you're going to have a real dialogue of cultures, is if you have that kind of tolerance.
And I would say, I think they're going to have to work this out within Afghanistan. The Taliban is going to have to mature. They can't be a bunch of extremist wackos. And given how much they have been able to take over the country, I don't know that the current government is going to be able to just exist without dealing with them in some way. I will say that while I was listening to you speak, I kept hearing in my head, cancel culture, because you think the United States isn't very old. I mean, it'll be our 250th anniversary of the revolution in 2026, but already what are they doing in all the schools? It is like the Cultural Revolution in China where Mao banned Confucius, right? Here, so many young people think they hate the United States. Well, what are they told? The United States was based on slavery, imperialism. They're told that the United States was the British Empire, exactly against which we had a revolution, and they don't know the actual history and intent of our nation. Similarly, I know when I was young and met Lyndon LaRouche and met this organization, it was such a relief to have a sense that there really was an intention for the good in the founding of the United States, because you're an American, you want to be good, you want your nation to be good, and you're fed all this garbage, and then you say, no, our nation was good. That was our intent. And I think for people in this region to have a sense, and that's probably why the British do such a job, and their agents, the pet monsters they create, like these extremist terrorist groups, destroy the culture, like the library at Baghdad, or the assault on Palmyra, or these other things. They want to destroy anything that represented civilization to convince people that that's not part of their history, that's not part of their identity. And I think American patriots should reflect on this. Many people are very upset about the cancel culture in the United States and the canceling of civilization, where they're trying to ban Shakespeare and Beethoven and everything else. But perhaps this has been a policy ongoing over centuries. Perhaps that's why there's a great deal of strife with nations we could otherwise be getting along with.
Yeah, I also think it's encouraging that the Taliban has been saying we don't want to have anything to do with ISIS, because in a certain sense they're looking at the bad aspects of themselves and of their own history, and looking at what they really want the future to be like. So without knowing a lot about them, I've never met with the Taliban people. I just say that we have to find, if we don't do it soon, very soon, things will get a lot worse. And we have to find a way for people to talk with each other, with just like trying to get the United States to talk with Russia, and on a basis of mutual respect, and not just allow people's buttons to be pushed. You can always find something wrong with somebody or something. There's nothing that's perfect. There are very few real total saints in the world. I think Gandhi was one of them. I don't think you could find anything wrong with Gandhi, but most people and most nations, they've got real problems that need to be solved, but you have to focus on the good in these nations, because ultimately humankind is good, and and humankind deserves to flourish because that the universe wants it to flourish. So.
Right. One other thought that really hit hard when I read Dave Shaven's first little report on the Helmand Valley Authority, which started, I guess, in 1946, because you realize that was right after the end of World War II, where the United States, the Soviet Union, China had been our ally against Japan. We had defeated fascism. We defeated the Nazis in Europe, a very important victory. And somehow the British twisted this all around to have us have decades of Cold War against the Soviet Union and to have a so-called special relationship with the British Empire, the one that they were so upset that President Trump was going to destroy by pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord. And the British, then what did they do? Divide and conquer all of these wars, all of this horrible policy everywhere. We got completely mired in population wars. Whereas if we had kept on the trajectory, if you think about where is Germany now, where is Japan now relative to where they were during World War II? They are powerful relatively, except for the crazy collapse we're in, but they became industrial powers and allies and friends of the United States. What would Afghanistan be if the United States had continued this Tennessee Valley Authority approach to that region? And the fact that it was happening immediately after World War II, and then by the 60s and 1970, it was completely reversed, even to the point, I think David didn't say it, but at one point, the US Army was actually bombing the dam that was built by an American company.
Yeah, I mean, in that region, I think it's always important for people to keep in mind the 1953 coup against Mossadegh. That was really an historic turning point. If the United States and the British had not overtly, just completely overtly staged a regime change revolution in Iran at that point, Iran could have been a dynamo of industrial and economic progress for the entire region, including neighboring Afghanistan. And history would have been completely different. And we somehow have to make sure that, we have to defeat the way that the British operate and the British ways of thinking, because that was just entirely a geopolitical ploy, and it destroyed the whole region for decades, and we cannot have that kind of thing happen again.
I agree, and I just want to, I think we're going to wrap up, but I just really want to, if I can do this right here, promote the conference tomorrow. There it is at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, and just you have a sense, you can see here, we have some really extraordinary speakers. Helga Zepp-LaRouche doing the keynote, Pino Arlacchi from Italy. He was the executive director of the UN Office for Drug Control. So that is a very big deal. The ambassador of Afghanistan to Canada, who I think probably his view of the matter is maybe a bit different than some of our friends. Ray McGovern, who people know, one of the founders of the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. Danny Sherson, US Army retired whistleblower. A Pakistani businessman, a representative from China, and others. So if you really want to actually have an informed opinion on this situation, I think it would be very good to be there tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. online on the schillerinstitute.com. If you have some dire emergency where you absolutely cannot watch it at that time, it will be archived. But I think this is very timely. It's not an opportunity that's going to exist forever. And if the United States can navigate a partnership with the major players in that region. I think it could be a turning point which pulls us back from the brink of thermonuclear war, which is where we're headed right now, especially with some of the unfortunate rhetoric we've heard from the White House in the last days. So, John, is there anything else that you would like people to know?
Well, there's plenty of things I'd like people to know, but a major thing is that come to the conference and work with the Schiller Institute and join the Schiller Institute as well. I happen to be the vice president of the Schiller Institute, so I have an interest in that. But the Schiller Institute has functioned as the only think tank, certainly in the United States, and as we're finding out, and probably in many parts of the world, the only place where you can have the kind of dialogue which is necessary in order to really get people not just talking at each other, but talking to each other, and maybe even working together again, working together for major to really put some flesh on the idea that the name of peace is development.
Thank you. And I would say the other thing, as I try to do with my symposia and my campaign, is that people who have disagreements, including even substantial ones, can nonetheless work together to achieve a common good, which is necessary for mankind. And we have to get to that point. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Thanks for your questions and comments. The conference is at 10 a.m. at schillerinstitute.com. And otherwise, please visit my website, Sare for Senate, SareForSenate.com, for more information on upcoming events, and if you'd like to sign up and volunteer for my campaign. So good night, and we will see you next week.